A mallard duck can poop out a live fish egg. Think about that for a second. It sounds like a punchline, or maybe a bit of trivia you'd find on the back of a cereal box. But the weight of that reality is the foundation for an ecological mystery that has baffled hikers and scientists for centuries. You are standing at the edge of an alpine lake, 11,000 feet above sea level. The air is thin enough to make your lungs ache, and the water is so clear it looks like liquid glass. This lake is a literal bowl of granite carved out by a glacier 10,000 years ago. It has no inlet stream. It has no outlet except for a vertical waterfall that drops 500 feet onto jagged rocks below. There is no physical way for a fish to swim here. It is a biological fortress, isolated from the rest of the world's river systems by sheer distance and verticality. And yet, as the sun hits the surface, you see the unmistakable ripple of a rising trout. It shouldn't be here. By every law of physics and fluid dynamics, that fish is an impossibility. You are looking at a creature that has somehow conquered a mountain, and the truth of how it did so is much weirder than a simple climb. The most common explanation people reach for is the simplest. They think the fish just swam up. We have all seen footage of salmon leaping over small weirs or battling against a moderate current, and our brains naturally project that tenacity onto every fish we see in high places. But that is a myth born of a misunderstanding of scale. A trout is a powerful swimmer, but it cannot breathe air, and it certainly cannot teleport. When you are looking at a lake perched on a plateau surrounded by cliffs, the swimming up theory collapses instantly. A waterfall isn't just a barrier, it is a death sentence for any organism trying to move against the flow of thousands of pounds of falling water. There is no hidden ladder. There is no secret tunnel through the mountain. To understand how that trout got into your mountain lake, we have to look past the water itself and start looking at the ghostly ladder of connections that link the high peaks to the valley floors, a ladder made of geological shifts, feathered transport, and human ambition. Imagine this ladder as a series of rungs that only appear once every few million years. This first rung is what scientists call vicariance, and it is the most patient way to move a fish. Instead of the fish traveling to the mountain traveled to the fish. This requires us to stop thinking of the Earth as a static map and start seeing it as a slow-moving conveyor belt. Millions of years ago, the land that now forms the great mountain ranges of the world, the Andes, the Rockies, the Himalayas, was much lower, often at or even below sea level. This land was crisscrossed by lazy rivers and expansive lowland lakes. The ancestors of modern fish lived in these waters quite comfortably. Then, the tectonic plates began to grind together. The crust buckled. Over millions of years, the ground began to rise, lifting those ancient lakes and rivers higher and higher into the atmosphere. The fish didn't have to move an inch, they simply stayed in their puddles while the world rose around them. Take a look at Lake Titicaca in the Andes, sitting at nearly 12,000 feet. It is home to a genus of fish called Orestias, which look like they belong in a lowland swamp, not a frigid mountain basin. These fish are there because the Andean plateau rose slowly enough that the water stayed contained in its basin, and the fish evolved to handle the dropping temperatures and thinning oxygen as they were hoisted into the sky. It's a slow-motion elevator ride. But this doesn't explain the fish in the smaller, younger lakes, the ones carved out by ice only a few thousand years ago. For those, the tectonic elevator is too slow. Those lakes were born empty, sterile basins of melted snow sitting in fresh wounds in the rock. To fill those, the ghostly ladder needed a different kind of rung, one that could move across the landscape in years rather than eons. It needed a way to bypass the waterfalls and the cliffs entirely. This is where the mallard comes back into the story. For a long time, the idea that birds carried fish eggs was treated as a just-so story, a convenient guess that lacked hard evidence. But in 2020, a researcher named Orshalia Vince decided to put this to a definitive test. She and her team fed thousands of eggs from common carp and Prussian carp to 8 mallard ducks. The goal was to see if any of those eggs could survive the brutal, acidic environment of a bird's digestive tract and come out the other end ready to hatch. Most of the eggs were destroyed, as you'd expect, but about 0.2% of them made it through. They were excreted alive, and when placed back in water, they hatched into perfectly healthy fry. While 0.2% sounds small, Consider that a single duck can eat tens of thousands of eggs in one sitting. Now multiply that by the millions of waterfowl that migrate across the globe every year. This is the internal pipeline. A duck feeds in a lowland pond, swallows a mouthful of eggs, and then flies over the mountain pass to land in a high-altitude lake to rest. A few hours later, it deposits a tiny, living biological time bomb into a new environment. But the ghostly ladder of the sky isn't just internal. There is also the external ferry. Fish eggs are notoriously sticky. Species like the yellow perch produce long, gelatinous ribbons of eggs that are designed to cling to aquatic vegetation. When a heron or a grebe wades through these shallows, those eggs can easily snag on their feathers or the mud caked on their feet. These birds then take off, and if the flight is short enough to keep the eggs moist, they are effectively hitchhiking across the terrain. Scientists have documented viable eggs surviving for over an hour in the open air while stuck to a bird's leg. In a world where a bird can fly 60 miles in that hour, a fish egg can easily leapfrog over 3 mountain ranges and a dozen impassable waterfalls. The sky is not a barrier, it is a superhighway. The lake that looks so isolated to us is actually just a rest stop on a continental flight path, and every time a bird splashes down, it's playing a game of biological roulette. This leads us to a darker, more deliberate rung on the ghostly ladder, the human hand. We like to think of ancient humans as people who merely reacted to their environment, but the deeper we look into the archaeological record, the more we see that they were master engineers of their own food supply. Long before the first European settlers arrived in the American West or the high Alps, indigenous peoples and mountain cultures were already seeding the landscape. Imagine you are a traveler 500 years ago. You are moving through a high mountain pass, a journey that takes days of grueling physical effort. You know that if you can establish a population of fish in a lake along that route, you are essentially building a permanent grocery store for your future self and your descendants. There is evidence that the Incas and other high-altitude civilizations moved fish in clay vessels filled with water, carefully oxygenating the containers as they climbed. They weren't just moving animals, they were investing in the landscape, turning a barren rock basin into a reliable source of protein. The ghostly ladder became a literal one during the mid-20th century, and this is where the story takes a turn for the surreal. After World War II, the United States and Canada saw a massive boom in outdoor recreation. People wanted to hike into the wilderness and find pristine fishing spots. The problem was that many of the most beautiful mountain lakes were naturally fishless. They were too young or too high for birds or geology to have filled them yet. State wildlife agencies decided to fix this, but they didn't want to carry buckets of water up a 10,000-foot peak. Instead, they took to the air. In a program often called Operation Fish Drop, pilots in the 1950s began flying small Cessnas over alpine lakes. They would fly as low as possible, sometimes just 50 feet above the water, and pull a lever. Thousands of tiny fingerling trout would tumble out of the belly of the plane, falling through the air like silver rain. It sounds like it should be a massacre. You would expect the fish to shatter on impact. But the physics of a small fish are surprisingly forgiving. Because they are so light and have a relatively high surface area, their terminal velocity is quite low. They don't hit the water with the force of a falling stone, they hit it more like a heavy raindrop. If the pilot gets the speed and altitude right, the survival rate for these skydivers is over 90%. In the state of Washington alone, over 500 high-altitude lakes were stocked this way in a single decade. We see a wild, mountain lake and assume it has been that way since the dawn of time, but in many cases, that lake is actually a product of mid-century industrial ambition. The silver thread of the fish's lineage didn't swim there, and it wasn't carried by a duck. It was dropped from the sky by a man in a flight suit. But why does this matter? Why go to all this effort to understand a few fish in a cold puddle? Because the arrival of a fish in a mountain lake is not a neutral event. It is an ecological shockwave. For thousands of years, these lakes existed in a state of fishless grace. They were ruled by invertebrates, giant water beetles, delicate mayfly larvae, and tiny, translucent shrimp. More importantly, they were the nurseries for mountain amphibians. Species like the mountain yellow-legged frog in the Sierra Nevada evolved specifically to live in these high basins. Because there were no fish, the frogs didn't need to be fast, and their tadpoles didn't need to hide. They were the apex predators of their tiny worlds. But the moment that ghostly ladder connects, whether by a duck's gut or a pilot's lever, that world ends. The trout is a voracious predator. It doesn't just live in the lake, it clears it out. The big reveal, the truth that most people don't want to hear when they see a trout jumping in a beautiful mountain lake, is that you are often looking at a biological desert. In many high-altitude regions, the introduction of fish has led to the near extinction of native frogs and salamanders. In some lakes, the fish eat so many of the zooplankton, the tiny organisms that eat algae, that the water actually changes color. The algae blooms unchecked, and the crystal-clear glass of the lake turns a murky, sickly green. We have spent a century trying to put fish into every corner of the world, thinking we were improving nature, only to realize that the isolation of these lakes was their greatest strength. The ghostly ladder that allowed the fish to climb the mountain also allowed a predator to enter a sanctuary. The rippling water that looks so peaceful is often the sound of a silent, underwater massacre that has been going on for decades. This is the hidden cost of the silver thread. We see a fish in a place it shouldn't be and we feel a sense of wonder, a sense that life finds a way. And it does. Life is incredibly persistent, whether it's hitching a ride in a duck's stomach or surviving a 100-foot fall from a plane. But every time a new connection is made on the ghostly ladder, the world becomes a little more the same. The unique, weird, fishless ecosystems of the high peaks are being replaced by the same few species of trout that we've carried with us everywhere. The mountain lake isn't a separate world anymore. It's just another outpost of the valley below, connected by a web of transport that we are only just beginning to map. The paradox of the fish in the mountain isn't just about how they got there, it's about what they did once they arrived. Think back to that mallard duck. It flies across the divide, lands in the water, and leaves behind a single egg. That egg hatches. It finds a mate, perhaps from another egg dropped a year later. Within a few decades, that one bird has fundamentally rewritten the history of that mountain. It has silenced the frogs. It has changed the chemistry of the water. It has turned a sterile basin into a thriving fishery. We look at the mountain and see a monument of permanence, a thing that doesn't change. But the fish prove us wrong. The mountain is porous. It is constantly being invaded and reshaped by the things that live on it and fly over it. The ghostly ladder is always there, moving life from the lowlands to the heights, one sticky egg or clay pot at a time. The lake is not an island, it is a destination. There is a specific kind of silence in a mountain lake that has been stocked with fish. If you go to a lake that is still truly fishless, though they are getting harder to find, you will hear the constant, frantic activity of the water's edge. You'll see thousands of tadpoles hugging the rocks, and the air will be thick with insects that have no fear of the water. But when you walk up to a lake with a healthy trout population, that activity vanishes. The shallows are empty. The frogs are gone. The only thing moving is the silver flash of a predator waiting for something to fall from the sky. We have spent so much time asking how the fish got there that we forgot to ask if they belong there in the first place. The answer, as it turns out, is written in the silence of the frogs. Consider the Operation Fish Drop pilots once more. They were often enthusiasts, people who loved the mountains and thought they were doing a service to the wild. They didn't see the trophic cascade they were triggering. They didn't see the extinction of the yellow-legged frog. They just saw the beauty of a silver fish hitting the water and swimming away. It is a perfect metaphor for our relationship with the natural world, a well-intentioned intervention that ignores the complex, invisible threads that hold an ecosystem together. We see the trout as a sign of a healthy lake, but in the high alpine, the trout is often the sign of a lake in trouble. The mystery of their arrival is a testament to the ingenuity of life, but it is also a warning about the unintended consequences of our desire to fix the wilderness. The silver thread that connects the high peaks to the sea is a beautiful thing to contemplate. It is a story of tectonic plates grinding together over millions of years, lifting ancient lineages into the clouds. It is a story of migratory birds carrying the seeds of new worlds in their feathers and their bellies. It is a story of human travelers, both ancient and modern, carrying their favorite foods into the most remote corners of the planet. It is a story of physics, biology, and history all meeting at the edge of a cold, clear lake. But as we stand there, watching that trout rise to take a fly, we have to acknowledge that the ghostly ladder works both ways. Every bridge we build, every connection we facilitate, changes both ends of the line. We often talk about the pristine wilderness as if it's a place that hasn't been touched by humans, but the fish in the mountain lake tell a different story. They tell us that the hand of man, the wings of a bird, and the movement of the earth are all part of the same interconnected system. There is no such thing as an isolated place. Even at 11,000 feet, surrounded by nothing but rock and sky, the influence of the valley is present. The fish are the proof. They are the living evidence of a world that is much smaller and much more fragile than it appears. The next time you see a ripple on a high-altitude lake, don't just ask how it got there. Ask what else was lost to make room for it. The ghostly ladder is always active. Even now, as you read this, a duck is landing in a high basin, or a storm is lifting water into the air, or a state agency is planning next year's aerial stocking. The movement of life up the mountain is a constant, relentless pressure. It is a force that reshapes the world in ways we are only starting to measure. And while the mystery of the impossible fish has been solved, the mystery of how we live with the consequences is just beginning. We have mastered the art of moving life around the planet, but we are still learning how to protect the places that are special precisely because they are hard to reach. The fish in the mountain isn't just a biological curiosity, it's a mirror held up to our own impact on the earth. This brings us back to the very beginning, to that throwaway line about the duck and the egg. It seems so small, so insignificant, a tiny biological accident happening in the middle of a migration. But that one accident is powerful enough to overthrow an entire ecosystem. It is powerful enough to jump over a canyon and climb a cliff. It is the ultimate proof that in nature, there are no true barriers, only temporary obstacles. The silver thread is a needle that sews the world together, stitching the mountains to the marshes until the boundaries between them begin to blur. It's an incredible feat of survival, but every stitch leaves a mark. You look down into the water one last time before heading back down the trail. The trout is still there, hovering near a submerged rock, a shadow in the sunlit water. It looks perfectly at home, a natural part of the scenery. But as you turn away, you notice something on the shore. You find the sun-bleached bones of a mountain frog, a species that hasn't been seen alive in this basin for 20 years. That small, brittle skeleton is the final, haunting proof of the cost of the ghostly ladder. The fish didn't just arrive, it took over. The silence of the lake isn't the peace of the wilderness, it's the quiet of a room where only one survivor is left. The silver thread is beautiful, yes, but it is also a garrote. It is a line that was pulled tight across the mountains, and as the fish moved up, the unique life of the high peaks began to choke. We have spent so much time marveling at the climb that we forgot to look at the view from the top. The mountain lake isn't a puzzle to be solved anymore. It's a crime scene that we're still trying to understand. And as you walk down the mountain, leaving the thin air behind, you realize that the most successful travelers aren't always the ones we should be cheering for. Sometimes, the most important thing about a place is that nothing can get to it. How did the fish get there? They were carried by the rising earth, by the wings of birds, and by the hands of people who thought they were doing the right thing. They got there because the world is more connected than we ever imagined. But as you reach the valley floor and look back up at the high, shimmering peaks, you can't help but wonder if some places are better left empty. The fish are in the mountain, but the mountain is no longer the same. The silver thread is tied, and it's never coming undone. If this deep dive into the hidden connections of our world made you look at the landscape a little differently, stay with us. We explore the mysteries that hide in plain sight, the ones that require us to look past the obvious and into the strange, often haunting reality of how nature actually works. There are so many more of these ghostly ladders to climb. Subscribe and join us for the next investigation as we pull back the curtain on the secrets of the wild. What other impossible things are hiding in the places you think you know? We're going to find out. The truth about the fish in the lake isn't found in the water, but in the silence that follows their arrival. It is a silence that tells a story of survival, intervention, and the heavy price of connection. We used to ask how the fish ended up in the mountains, but now we know. They were carried by the earth, the sky, and us. And as that sun-bleached frog bone proves, the real mystery isn't how the fish got to the top of the world, it's how we're going to live with what they've done to it. The silver thread is permanent, and the silence is only getting louder.